She vanished from the spotlight for over 4 decades, carrying a secret too heavy to share, until now. Ginger Alden, once engaged to the king himself, has finally broken her silence. What she reveals is not a scandal, but something far more haunting, a truth that unravels the carefully constructed ending the world accepted without question. Could it be that Elvis Presley didn't just die, but disappeared? Her voice trembles, not with fear, but with the weight of what's been buried all these years. Stay with us, because what you're about to hear will forever change the way you remember Elvis Presley. To most, Ginger Alden was just another beautiful face in the orbit of Elvis Presley, another name in the long list of women linked to the king of rock and roll. But what the cameras never captured and what the headlines never told is that Ginger wasn't just his girlfriend. She was his chosen partner, the woman he asked to marry him, the one who stood closest to him as he mapped out what was supposed to be the next chapter of his life. Behind the gates of Graceland, their relationship wasn't built on red carpets or stage lights. It was formed in the private, often painful moments that never made the news. While millions saw Elvis Presley as a legend, Ginger saw something different, someone different. She wasn't there for the performance. She was there when the curtain fell. She witnessed the exhaustion in his eyes after the applause faded, heard the tension in his voice when the weight of his fame became too much to bear. Elvis led her into a part of his world that no fan, no journalist, no biographer ever truly reached. She saw the cracks in the crown, the man who paced barefoot at night, restless and questioning everything. And it's what Ginger saw in those quiet, unguarded moments that sets her story apart. While the world clung to the polished image of the star, she was witnessing something far more complex, something raw, unraveling, and real. The struggles he shared, the words he whispered, the things he did when no one else was watching, all of it adds up to a picture that's darker, deeper, and far more mysterious than anyone has ever imagined. And now, for the first time, she's ready to reveal what she's carried all these years. Long after the world had gone to sleep, Graceland would come alive in an entirely different way. Elvis Presley, barefoot and deep in thought, would wander the halls in the early hours of the morning, pacing, whispering, sometimes staring out windows like he was searching for something just beyond reach. Ginger Alden, often the only one awake to see it, watched quietly as the man loved by millions transformed into someone burdened, haunted even. He wasn't talking about music or fame in those moments. He spoke instead of transformation, of past lives, of spiritual escape. He devoured books on reincarnation and personal reinvention, dog-earing pages and scribbling cryptic notes in the margins. It was during one of those hushed, sleepless nights that he turned to Ginger and said something she never forgot. Fame is the most beautiful prison you'll ever see. There was no trace of glamour in his voice, only quiet resignation. It wasn't a complaint, it was a confession. The adoration of millions had become a gilded cage, trapping him in an identity he no longer recognized. Ginger didn't know whether he was speaking metaphorically or hinting at something more, but she could feel it. This wasn't just a man worn out by celebrity. It was someone actively trying to figure out how to escape it. The more time passed, the more his musings took on a new tone. More focused, more deliberate. He spoke less about concerts and more about vanishing. Ginger began to wonder, were these just the late-night ramblings of an overworked star? Or was she witnessing the early stages of something far more profound or far more dangerous? The questions piled up. The answers never came. But one thing was becoming crystal clear. Something was shifting inside Elvis. Something Ginger could feel but couldn't yet name. And whatever it was already in motion. Long after the world had gone to sleep, Graceland would come alive in an entirely different way. Elvis Presley, barefoot and deep in thought, would wander the halls in the early hours of the morning, pacing, whispering, sometimes staring out windows like he was searching for something just beyond reach. Ginger Alden, often the only one awake to see it, watched quietly as the man loved by millions transformed into someone burdened, haunted even. He wasn't talking about music or fame in those moments. He spoke instead of transformation, of past lives, of spiritual escape. He devoured books on reincarnation and personal reinvention, dog-earing pages and scribbling cryptic notes in the margins. It was during one of those hushed, sleepless nights that he turned to Ginger and said something she never forgot. Fame is the most beautiful prison you'll ever see. There was no trace of glamour in his voice, only quiet resignation. It wasn't a complaint, it was a confession. The adoration of millions had become a gilded cage, trapping him in an identity he no longer recognized. Ginger didn't know whether he was speaking metaphorically or hinting at something more, but she could feel it. This wasn't just a man worn out by celebrity. It was someone actively trying to figure out how to escape it. The more time passed, the more his musings took on a new tone. More focused, more deliberate. He spoke less about concerts and more about vanishing. Ginger began to wonder, were these just the late-night ramblings of an overworked star? Or was she witnessing the early stages of something far more profound or far more dangerous? The questions piled up. The answers never came. But one thing was becoming crystal clear. Something was shifting inside Elvis. Something Ginger could feel but couldn't yet name. And whatever it was already in motion. Tucked away in a private drawer that only Ginger Alden ever opened was something she never expected to find. A letter. Not typed, not drafted for lawyers or managers. Just a single piece of paper, handwritten in Elvis Presley's unmistakable scrawl. It wasn't addressed to anyone. There was no signature at the bottom, no date to mark its importance. It simply existed, silent, sealed, and buried among his most personal belongings. And the moment Ginger unfolded it, she knew instantly. This was not just a note. This was a window into a mind unraveling in private. The words on the page weren't angry or bitter. They weren't even entirely coherent, more like pieces of poetry, fragments of thought never meant to be shared. But one line stood out with a clarity that made Ginger's breath catch in her throat. I feel like I'm living someone else's life. It was raw, unfiltered, and almost painful to read. He spoke not of fame, but of suffocation. Not of glory, but of being devoured by the machine that once celebrated him. He described feeling hollowed out by the very people who once swore they loved him. Ginger read the letter again and again in the years that followed, and each time something new emerged. A phrase, a pause, a feeling she hadn't noticed before. But what haunted her the most wasn't what the letter said. It was what it meant. There was no explanation, no clear message. Just the heavy, almost eerie weight of something unfinished. Was it a quiet farewell to the life he no longer recognized? Or was it a coded message? Something he never dared speak out loud, but left behind like a breadcrumb for someone to find? The letter never revealed its purpose, but its existence raised a question that still lingers today. Was this Elvis saying goodbye? Or was it his first step towards something no one ever saw coming? The final night they spent together wasn't somber or filled with dread. It was strangely electric. Ginger recalls a renewed energy in Elvis, a spark in his eyes that hadn't been there for weeks, maybe months. He moved with a quiet excitement, flipping through worn books on spirituality, scribbling phrases on scraps of paper, humming to himself as if something within him had finally clicked. At one point, he asked Ginger to pack a small bag, just in case. She laughed, thinking it was one of his spontaneous ideas. But then he looked at her, half smiling, and said words she's never forgotten. We might be taking a trip no one would believe. It was said lightly, almost playfully, but beneath it was something else, something deeper. Like he was hinting at a secret too big to say out loud. As the night stretched on, the air seemed to grow still with unspoken weight. Elvis moved deliberately, placing certain belongings near the door, rearranging items with a calm intensity that didn't make sense at the time. Then, without warning, his mood shifted. He grew quiet, almost solemn. Turning to Ginger, he gently placed a hand on her shoulder and whispered, "I've got one last thing to take care of." There was no fear in his voice, only focus. And with that, he walked down the hallway, disappearing into the soft shadows of Graceland. She didn't follow. Something in the moment told her not to. Something about the way he said it made it feel final, even though no one had spoken of endings. When Ginger awoke hours later, the silence was immediate and unnatural. It wasn't the kind of quiet that comes with a peaceful morning. It was hollow, still, as if something had been removed from the house entirely, not just physically, but spiritually. Elvis wasn't in his usual chair. The lights he always left on were off. His routines, so precise, so predictable, were suddenly broken. But there was no panic, no chaos. Everything was exactly in its place, and yet nothing felt right. What she felt in that moment wasn't grief. It wasn't fear. It was mystery, thick and unshakable. As if something had already happened, something irreversible, and she was the only one left behind to feel its echo. In the days that followed, the world descended into shock and mourning. But behind the velvet ropes and flashing cameras, something more unsettling was unfolding. Ginger Alden, the woman Elvis had chosen to share his life with, was quietly being edged out of the narrative. Almost overnight, the warmth she had once felt from the Presley circle turned cold. Conversations grew short, glances avoided her. It wasn't an argument or an accusation, it was silence. A chilling, deliberate silence that made her feel like she was no longer welcome in the very story she had lived through. When reporters began to call, Ginger was told to remain quiet, out of respect, out of love, out of loyalty. And for a time she did. But when she finally tried to speak, softly, carefully, without fanfare, her words were dismissed, twisted, or completely ignored. Headlines painted her as the fragile fiancée, the woman who couldn't cope, the one whose story didn't quite fit the clean narrative the world wanted to accept. And yet Ginger never lashed out. She didn't write scandalous books. She didn't sell interviews. She simply held on to what she knew, quietly carrying the weight of a truth no one wanted to hear. But the most haunting part of all wasn't the silence. It was what that silence covered. No one asked her the most basic questions, not what she saw, not what she heard, not how that final night really felt. It was as if the entire world agreed to turn the page without ever reading the last paragraph. Ginger wasn't just being ignored, she was being erased. And in that eerie absence of curiosity, she began to wonder if the truth she held was simply too inconvenient, too disruptive, too real for a world that had already made up its mind. After decades of silence, Ginger Alden finally allowed herself to speak, not in a press conference or through a best-selling memoir, but quietly, in a private off-camera conversation shared only with those she deeply trusted. There was no theatrical reveal, no dramatic flair. Her words came slowly, thoughtfully, like someone exhaling a truth they'd carried alone for far too long. What she shared wasn't loud. It was unsettling in its calmness. Ginger revealed that during those final weeks, Elvis wasn't preoccupied with recording sessions or planning his grand return to the stage. According to her, his focus was on something far more radical, not coming back at all. She described a man who no longer saw fame as a dream fulfilled, but as a burden too heavy to carry. A man who had grown tired of being a symbol, a brand, a spectacle. Ginger spoke of whispered conversations, quiet moments when Elvis hinted at a different kind of future, one far away from the spotlight. He wasn't defeated or broken. He was clear-eyed, deliberate, and strangely at peace. He wanted a life beyond the legend, a clean slate, a chance to simply exist without expectation. He didn't say the words directly. He didn't have to. Every action, every cryptic phrase, every carefully packed detail seemed to suggest one thing. He was ready to step away, not just from the stage, but from the world that thought it owned him. And perhaps most haunting of all was Ginger's certainty. She wasn't guessing. She wasn't speculating. Her voice didn't tremble, and her story never wavered. It was the steadiness in her tone, the timing of her confession, and the decades she chose to stay silent that now speak louder than anything else. She never once used the words faked or escaped, but the implication lingered in the air like smoke. It makes you pause. It makes you wonder. Could it be possible? Could Elvis Presley, the most iconic figure in modern music, have truly walked away from it all, right under the world's nose, with only one person knowing the truth? For over 4 decades, Ginger Alden chose silence, not because she was afraid and not because she was forgotten, but because she believed some stories were too sacred to be shouted across headlines. While others speculated, profited, and sensationalized, Ginger quietly held her truth like a fragile relic, untouched by fame, untouched by ego. She didn't rush to cash in. She didn't write tell-alls or tour talk shows. Instead, she waited out of something far more powerful than fear: love and respect for the man she knew and for the story the world never really heard. And now her voice finally breaks through the silence, not with spectacle, but with stunning clarity. This isn't tabloid fodder. It's not another rumor tossed into the noise. Ginger's confession doesn't scream. It whispers. It beckons. It draws you in like a secret you've almost remembered. She offers no wild accusations, no dramatic claims, just a steady, unshakable account of what she saw, what she felt, and what she was never allowed to say, until now. Her words are less a revelation than a reckoning, reshaping everything we thought we knew about how one of the most iconic lives in history came to an end. So now the question remains, haunting and impossible to ignore. What if Elvis Presley didn't die? What if he escaped? What if the story we've all accepted was only the version we were meant to see? Ginger's quiet confession opens a door, but what lies beyond it is far from settled. There are more details, more signs, more questions that linger in the shadows. And if this is just the beginning, then what else is still waiting to be uncovered? Because sometimes the truth doesn't die with the legend. It just waits for someone brave enough to tell it. If this story has you questioning everything you thought you knew about Elvis Presley, you're not alone. We want to hear from you. What do you believe really happened? Share your thoughts, theories, and reactions in the comments below. And if you found this video as compelling as we did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story the world was never meant to hear. Share this video with someone who still believes the legend is over, because the truth might just be hiding in plain sight.